Taylor.
Hey there.
Hey. It's confusing to see myself twice.
I apologize for that.
Nah, it's fine. So, I guess you can try again one more time, like actually at 3:20.
I'm trying right now, and then yeah, I will try again at 3:20. This is so
I
frustrating.
need to be recording right now.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. Oh wait. Oh, reclaim host. There we go.
Especially on a Friday afternoon. It's amazing to be able to have this conversation. And so thank you for your presence and your space and your energy. So my name is Kate Diodamo, so great job. I'm with Reframe Health and Justice. We're a queer and trans people of color consulting collective that works at the intersection of harm reduction, criminal legal reform, and centers really healing. My background though is really centered in sex worker rights. I came up as a community organizer, and now I get to do work around advocacy more generally, but really specifically policy on the federal level, and work with local organizations who are interested in engaging in advocacy in their local spaces in the way that they see fit. And so I basically get to come in and hang out with folks that do what I did like 10 years ago.
Wonderful. Makayla. If Makayla's not back right now, Ricky, feel free to go ahead and tell us a little more about yourself.
Yeah, hey. Thank you all for being here. I'm Ricky. I work at Women with a Vision, and I really, I've got my hand in a lot of pots at Women with a Vision, but I do a lot of administrative stuff, and then also I've been working on our police divestment program, which has been taking place over the past year or so. So it's a really exciting time to be sort of doing this work. But then that also brings up a lot of work around sex worker rights, sex worker criminalization. And I'm originally from New York. I moved down to New Orleans because of school, and then stuck around because my partner's from here. And so it's been really exciting to be in New Orleans, sort of taking a much more honestly community-based approach than what I've experienced in New York, mostly because it's a smaller, more tight-knit community, and I've learned a lot, and I'm excited to be here with y'all.
And we are thrilled to have you. Do we have Makayla on yet by any chance? If you're speaking, you might be muted. All right. So let's see. Oh, no problem. I will speak more slowly. I feel like I've been in New York for too long and the pace has rubbed off on me. Originally from Georgia, I don't have that pace anymore. Dan, do we know if Makayla will be joining us, or shall we go ahead and jump right into the panel?
I'm reaching out to Makayla right now, so y'all can go ahead and get started.
Sounds good to me.
Just a
All
quick
right. Oh.
caveat from me, I do tend to speak really, really quickly. If I'm speaking too quickly, please interject sooner rather than later, because I'll totally be on a different thought by the time if y'all don't interrupt right away, but please do interrupt.
Great. And I will check myself as well. So the first question for y'all is, what do we mean when we use the term criminalized?
Sure, I can hop into that one. And also, please, I also have the New York problem. It sounds like all of us inherited this issue. So if I speak too fast, also feel free if I use terms or acronyms that anyone wants me to explain, absolutely feel free to. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, but do not hesitate to ask. And I don't mind being interrupted at all. So when we talk about criminalization, what we're talking about is really one form of social control. And so we're talking about behavior that receives punishment, especially punishment from the state, but is generally broader than that. And so what I mean when we say criminalization is kind of two things. That when we're talking about social control, we're talking about behaviors that are ultimately punished. But when we talk about criminalization, we're also talking about policing. Criminalization doesn't really exist without policing. Policing puts criminalization into action. And so we have to talk about kind of both of them. You know, something can be criminal on the books, but if they're not policing for it, or if they're only policing specific communities, that's a different experience. So when we talk about criminalization, we have to make sure that we're thinking about how it plays out, not just what laws are passed. Second, when we're talking about the context of criminalization, we have to be sure to say, okay, there is behavior where the state is going to punish you if you engage in that behavior. But it's also broader than that. So there are interactions where you're like, all right, prostitution is criminalized in every single state, including Nevada, in the country. So if you engage in that, you might be inviting police. But systems are bigger than that. Criminalization filters through these massive webs and networks of a lot of different systems that sometimes lead to prison, but also have punishments in and of themselves. If you are engaged in sex work and someone calls the child welfare system on you, for example, that's still a form of punishment. If you have a bank account and it gets flagged that you might be engaging in sex work and putting money into that bank account, you might have your bank account closed. If you're outed because you're arrested and they put up your mugshot, you might be isolated from your family. And so when we say criminalization, we're probably going to talk about it in a way that we're familiar with, but it's really important to contextualize along those pieces that when we're talking about criminalized policed behavior, we're talking about behavior that receives punishment from different institutions in society in an effort to control especially specific people's bodies and what they can and cannot do with those bodies.
Great, thank you for that really succinct answer. Ricky, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
No, and when we were prepping, I think Makayla and I were both like, that was perfect. They did it perfectly. We're just going to leave it at that. So no, I'm good.
Great. So piggybacking off of criminalizing bodies and behavior, what does it mean for our bodies themselves to be criminalized? And maybe give some examples.
Yeah, so the first things that I think of when I think about criminalized bodies are trans folks, sex workers, and pregnant folks, right? And then, of course, Black bodies. And really, Black bodies exist at the intersection of all of those subgroups. But zooming out a little bit, you asked for an example, when we're thinking about sort of the ways that trans bodies are policed, we're really talking about, or one example would be like the walking while trans bills, right? And what that really puts into effect is there can be kind of the way that Kate was saying, there's this writing that's on the books, and this is what is criminalized. But the way that we actually see that play out most often is at those intersections, right? We see Black trans folks, Black sex workers, Black pregnant folks are the most criminalized, right, in each of those subgroups. And really, when I think about someone who's criminalized, and this is partially because of the work, but also because our work is based in fact, that Black trans women sex workers bear the brunt of this sort of criminalizing system. And so another example would be the CANS law, right, which is the crimes against nature statutes that existed in Louisiana and New Orleans, that basically made it so that if you looked like you had the intent to commit a sexual crime against nature, which is anything that is not missionary male-female sex, you could be put in jail for that, You didn't have to be in the middle of a transaction. You just had to look like you had the intent. That plays out as saying this is an easy way to put Black sex workers, Black trans folk in jail. And there is the reality that Black trans women are a large and most visible group of sex workers, and we'll get more into like why they are the most visible, because there is a whole system of privilege within the world of sex work that is important to criminalization as well.
And Kate, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I don't, but it looks like Makayla's on.
Yes, indeed. Makayla is on. I wanted us to go ahead and finish out that question. So I'm going to let Makayla introduce herself. And Makayla, when you do, just offer up your pronouns, your position, organization, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, hi everyone. Sorry I was late. Time zones are a horrible thing. So yeah, I'm Makayla, she, her, ella. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and I commonly work with SWAP San Antonio and with URGE in Texas, our San Antonio chapter. Yeah, so that's all I do is, you know, talk about abortion access and decriminalizing sex work. Those are my two big things.
Wonderful. So Makayla, we've just gone into the first couple of questions about what it means when we use the term criminalized and what it means for bodies to be criminalized, as well as a few examples. Before I move on to the next question, just a quick reminder, if you have additional questions that crop up during the course of this conversation, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will be fielding those afterwards. So don't feel like you have to hold your peace if you have something that you want to put in and speak up about, lest you forget. So moving along, we've talked a little bit about how bodies are criminalized and what it means for those bodies to be criminalized, but how is pregnancy specifically criminalized, and what does it look like for different demographics?
Sorry, I had to pull up my notes real quick. So in my, my way that I have seen it, like pregnancy has always been criminalized in like these macro ways that are, big and huge that we see in like legislation, but they're also like criminalized in like micro ways that we, don't often think about, like self-managed abortion, medication abortion, even though like it's a valid way, they're still criminalizing how we do that and how we take control of our pregnancies and of our bodies, even if it's not, a wanted pregnancy, things like that.
And so just to kind of build on that, so a lot of times when we talk about the criminalization of pregnancy, it's really narrowly focused. We talk about access to abortion. Sometimes we get to talk about self-managed abortion and medication abortion and how those laws are implemented. And now, especially that we're seeing different laws around that are being used against pregnant folks who want to terminate their pregnancies, or pregnant folks who miscarry, when we're talking about things like, endangerment of a fetus. And getting used against either people who terminate, or fetal endangerment laws being used against people who are substance users. There's a lot of different ways that pregnancy in and of itself is, if we're talking about criminalization as that extension of a form of social control and a form of social control that's about punishment, it's really about what are the different ways that we are trying to control who gets pregnant, who brings that child to term, or who, carries that pregnancy to term, and what happens. And we also, thank you, and I will slow down a little bit. One of the other things that when we talk about criminalization of pregnancy, it's not just a person and the fetus. It is bigger than that. And I want to really uplift the work of Kara Page in particular, who has done incredible work around understanding the medical industrial complex. and Andrea Ritchie, who has uplifted the way that criminalization specifically impacts Black and Brown women differently, and Black and Brown femmes. And really also talk about the way that we criminalize birth and the way that we have criminalized historically midwives and birth workers and doulas. And that's so much about really forcing pregnant people to exist really within the context of the medical industrial complex. And, you know, it's not just the criminalization of those birth workers and putting them really having to take on liability, asking them to put themselves in harm's way. But if you don't want to be in a hospital, you're pathologized. You're seen as unfit. You're seen as dangerous. You're more likely to invite the child welfare system in because you wanted to do something different that honors you and your healing and your legacy as a person building a family in a multi-generational world. And you're seen as really, you know, if you don't do things this specific way, we are going to judge and punish you until that feels like the only option, or else you're clearly unfit and you may or may not even want to be a parent. And so that tells us that we're almost invited to come in and take this child away from you. And so when we're talking about birth, and I know Ricky has a great expansion and a great framework that I've really appreciated. So I'll popcorn it over to you.
Yeah, something that came up when we were talking about it, just the three of us, was that and something that I honestly noticed kind of just like sitting on the couch with my partner's stepmother. We were watching an episode of TLC or an episode of something on TLC, and this person, I don't know what the show was, but they were deciding that they were going to have their child at home, right? And her stepmother, who is a nurse practitioner, says it's so dangerous to have a baby outside of a hospital. It's just so many things can go wrong, right? There's this deep ingrained understanding that is, we know, especially for Black women, false, but in general also just false, that it's so dangerous to not have a baby in a hospital. This idea that this was the reason that we had June Medical versus Guy go to the Supreme Court. Y'all may have heard about the Supreme Court decision that just recently came down saying that this abortion restriction law was unconstitutional, and what they were trying to do, make it so that basically the doctor that was operating at the clinic or that was performing the abortion at the clinic had to have admitting privileges at a hospital within two hours, right? And that would have shut down 2 out of the only 3 abortion clinics that exist in Louisiana today. So we would have, there are so many barriers that come up, right, when you only have 1 abortion clinic or really only 3 abortion clinics. But this idea that it's not safe to have a child, or first of all, that things just go wrong all the time, right? That like you need to be in a hospital anytime that pregnancy is happening, and that it's just so unsafe. We know that abortions are also very safe as medical procedures go. But there's this idea that, again, like inviting the hospital into your body, into your space, that doesn't need to really exist there, we know from medical data. And that for a lot of, especially Black women in Louisiana, are actually much more dangerous, right? It's much more dangerous to have the hospital just involved in your body than it is to have a home birth with a doula or a midwife. And when we think about this idea that also it again, prioritizing the hospital inevitably prioritizes not the child bearer, but the fetus or the baby, right? And so my mom talks about this moment where they thought that I was in distress as an infant, and they just kind of flung her legs open and weren't telling her anything that was happening. And there are 10 residents, and she had to yell and scream beyond her sort of already painful yelling and screaming to get them to stop touching her, because she didn't know what was happening to her body, because the infant at that point is the central patient, right? And that it's so important for the parent, the child bearer, and honestly, even if that parent is not a child bearer, to receive care before, during, and after pregnancy. That is something that doctors almost entirely neglect, and something that doulas and midwives and people who do that kind of work are very, very intentional about, right? Because there are needs that you can't meet for the child without meeting the needs of the parent. And that's where we get into this reproductive justice framework, right? Where you're thinking about how you keep a family safe, not just in the moment where a child is born or an infant is born, or at this moment of conception, right? But how the family is going to be able to thrive during a pregnancy, after a pregnancy, and what that looks like for each person in the family. Because if the family is not okay, then the infant that is raised in that family is not okay. And that's when we see things like children moving into the foster care system, which we know often leads to either prison or another sort of cyclical system of poverty.
Thank you for masterfully weaving those intersectional threads. I think that's something that maybe people don't always consider. So I really appreciate that. So I'm going to pause us for a brief moment because we need to fix the interpretation. It shouldn't take very long. I just want to give us an opportunity to take care of that. So,
Nope, we can keep going. We fixed it without having to pause. We're good.
Already fixed. Well, there we go. Great news. All right. So moving along to the next question. Could you all talk a little bit more about race and gender disparities when it comes to the criminalization of sex, bodies, work, and pregnancy? I know that's a big, wide open question, but yeah.
I said we were going to come back to this, and here we are. I said earlier that Black trans sex workers are sort of like at the center of this conversation, right? They are the most highly criminalized and honestly the most highly brutalized and are the most murdered. But when we think about Black trans sex workers, a big part of the reason that they're so criminalized is also because they tend to be the least privileged within the sort of sex working subset in many cities. So when first of all, you have this sort of hierarchy of privilege, right? Within the sex work community, you can be working, in a club, sort of tucked away. At least there's a bouncer, there's somebody between you and the outside. Then there's just, sort of spaces where you're a little bit more insulated. Maybe somebody knows that they have to go look there, but you're not sort of in the wide open. And then there's like outright street-based sex work where you're sort of walking down the street. And that's, first of all, I think the image that we get most when we see shows about cops or, all these sorts of things, right? And so it's very normal for us to criminalize them as parts of society. But then it's also, they are just the most visible if you're just driving somewhere, right? Not in a specific part of town. I mean, maybe in a specific part of town. But they just tend to be the most visible. And so that means that one, if somebody doesn't like what they see, they can become criminalized, right? And that goes back to this sort of idea of the way that the community polices, but also that there's a difference between that there's a sort of a lane that you have to be in, right? That the community can police in one way, or they can aid criminalization. And so there's that moment where the community member says, well, I don't like that, I'm going to call the police. And that leads to policing in a really can be a really horrible or violent way. Or it can be the sort of situation where, cops know that this is where, this sort of thing happens, or and to the point where they know that this one person is going to be there, that they can pick up and throw in the back of their car and make an arrest, right? But I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Kate and Makayla.
Yeah, and I think just so, you know, it's one of those things that I think everyone kind of knows, but still should be said, that criminalization increases vulnerability to violence, to STI and HIV transmission, to exploitation. Criminalization and policing take away autonomy, self-determination, and options. If you know that a stroll is policed a lot and they're looking for you, you're going to move to different areas, but what it does is that it takes away that option. And so people are generally constrained as far as some of those safety decisions. And I'm more than happy to kind of talk about that, but I think just it should definitely be just said straightforward. Criminalization leads to violence, it leads to harm. And really when we're talking about criminalization, I feel like the opposite of criminalization is liberation. If we want to look at who's being criminalized and how people are being criminalized, we should just ask ourselves whose liberation, both personally and collectively, is most threatening to the status quo. And so that informs us so much as far as what these laws look like. Laws on sex work are really about who has access to unrestricted capital. Instead of being on SNAP benefits where they tell you what to eat, housing assistance where they tell you where to live and can walk in and check out your house and try to figure out how many people live there whenever the state wants, sex work allows people who are marginalized from formal economies to access unrestricted capital to make those decisions themselves. And that means that, like, Black and brown communities, it means that trans folks and gender nonconforming folks, queer communities, it means that femme-led communities are able to enact self-determination, are able to build collective power, and that's threatening to the status quo. And so when we're talking about different bodies and how those different bodies are policed, you know, we're talking about people of color because it threatens white supremacy. We're talking about trans and gender nonconforming people because it undermines ciscentric heteronormativity. It's people in poverty because that undermines inherited wealth and the continuation of that wealth. It's migrant folks for whom even if you are in the country in a documented way, not everyone has a work visa. And a work visa can control exactly what kind of work you do and who you work for and whether or not you're allowed to transfer employers and how much you're going to make. There's going to be a cap on that. But if we allowed migrants to freely interact with informal labor, it would allow people to cross borders a lot easier. It would undermine the idea that we have national borders and they're not false and bullshit and a human rights violation. It's about allowing Indigenous folks access to capital and community power because that would undermine colonization. And so when we talk about the way that race and gender plays out in terms of criminalization, just ask yourself, whose liberation, whose self-determination, whose collective power would most undermine the status quo and the power structures that be, because those are going to be the bodies that are policed and those are going to be the laws on the books.
Yeah, Kate, you're a literal genius, like big brain energy, and I love that. But yeah, like going off of like what they said, I think labor has also, you know, been criminalized for a lot of like different identities under the guise of like protection, like false protection. Yeah, so like centering like street-based Black trans sex workers, again, like they're, you know, just thrown in jail because the police are like, this is to protect you. And we all know that that's not true. And we all know that there's just pushing these people into cycles that are never going to be ending for them, because once you go there, you're not going to be able to get out. So we know that these systems like are directly harming people, and we just need to like, you know, liberation is the only way through it. But that comes, you know, from people like me, a white woman, just like recognizing where I stand and how to protect these people around me with my privilege. Yeah, that's what I got.
Thank you for that. And Makayla, you do bring up such a great point about things that are supposedly there to protect people, like FOSTA SESTA, which we know, drove sex work offline and made it so much harder to vet clients. So those were all really excellent points, and thank you for illuminating them. So when it comes to being criminalized, how can we ourselves protect ourselves from being criminalized because of our sex, our work, whether that's sex work or elsewhere, sort of in the gray economy, our bodies, or our pregnancies?
So I'll start. So I think this is where it started to get kind of tricky for us, I'll be honest. Protecting yourself is sort of one of the things it's all mitigation, right? And you can't guarantee that you're gonna be okay. But you can try to take all the steps to secure that. I think to me, the most important thing is knowing your rights. That will, again, only get you so far, but knowing your rights can be really threatening to somebody who's trying to police or just be violent towards you. Know also who you can trust, right? In your community. I think it's really important when when I talk about at least our sort of micro space in New Orleans, we have a couple of different organizations that are for sex workers. We are one of them, but there are also spaces that are entirely led by sex workers, and we are led by sex workers, but by sex workers for sex workers, and really revolve around making sure that there's a safe space in New Orleans, right? That's bare. Also know that when some of these organizations are going to have flaws, most of these organizations are going to have flaws. Not every organization is going to be as safe for trans folk or people of color. And that is also something that you need to know. And what this really means is like, talk to other people who are exactly in your position, or somebody who's as close to being in your position as far as gender identity, labor, and sorry, I'm like stumbling a little bit. If you're someone who uses substances, then speak to people who use substances and know where your safe spaces are, right? Know how you can be pigeonholed, but also know what resources exist, because there is inevitably going to be a set of survival resources in your community. That also means practicing harm reduction. Harm reduction gets really tricky because there's a part of harm reduction that walks the really fine line between harm reduction and respectability politics. And that's difficult, but do whatever you need to do. No, that's not what I'm gonna say. Do your best to be true to yourself while also keeping yourself safe, right? What we don't wanna do is say, I'm going to stop expressing my body in this way, because that's like the dangerous part of that space, right? That's respectability politics. But know what you need to do in order to keep yourself safe, and what risks you are or are not willing to take. That's really important. When we talk about harm reduction, we started as harm reduction drug policy and handing out syringes, right? But one of the most important parts of harm reduction that people don't think about is disposing of syringes safely, right? So you don't want people to be using old syringes, whether it's because they've been used before or because they're no longer sharp enough to be safe. But you also don't want people leaving syringes around. Part of that is because the people in your community, both the other folks that are using substances, I'm going to, I see that note to explain respectability politics, and I will, if I don't, just remind me. But then the other folks who live in your community who are not using substances, it keeps everybody safe to have syringes not on the ground if you're walking down the street. It also, because there's an immediate threat of being poked by a syringe. But on top of that, it creates a system in a community where somebody may know that you use drugs, and if there's somebody that you can trust, then so long as what you're doing is not threatening their lives, their actual life, not what they perceive to be a threat, right? then everybody can exist in harmony. And that's really important. Now, that does sort of breach respectability politics. Respectability politics is the idea that, let's say, like, so I'm thinking about this actually right now. I'm showing up to this meeting in a t-shirt and a ponytail. And that's me doing what I feel most comfortable doing. I could also have shown up to this meeting in like a super low cut thing and everybody could see my boobs, and like that is also sort of not what a conventional idea of like meeting attire might be. I could also have shown up to this meeting in like a jacket with a nice little button-up shirt, right? And that is sort of like your understanding of what somebody should wear to a meeting. So there's sort of the way that you would appear to be a respectable person, right? the other ways, and for some people, wearing that like jacket is going to be what makes sense for them, what is like true to who they are, right? And that's fair. But right now I'm wearing my like Women with a Vision drug policy harm reduction t-shirt because I'm here to make a point. In a different situation, if I'm talking about like drug use, right? There's this idea that like people come in all the time to get syringes and they're like, oh, well, we're not like junkies. We just use drugs, but like we contribute to society, right? Like that's somebody who's kind of trying to play into respectability politics because they don't want me, the person who is, you know, helping them with whatever service. Right. And somebody just made a point about hair, right? But they don't want me to perceive them as somebody who is just like not being functional at all, right? When what I know is that I see everybody from, you know, folks that are living in sort of galleries, which is like a large space of people who are using drugs, sort of in a community, to people who are like sort of respectable, right? And going to their jobs from 9 to 5 every single day, and picking up their kids after work, and you know what I mean, doing all these things, right? So that it also, respectability politics also play big time into stigma, and stigma is harmful. We know this. So somebody just there are so many examples you can think of about respectability politics. A lot of us play into them because we have to, because it's part of survival. And some of us say fuck it all, right? Sorry. But I'm gonna kick it over to Kate and Makayla because I've been talking for a really long time.
Yeah, and I think to build off of the comment about respectability politics, you know, a lot of times there's a level of visibility. I'm gonna speak really specifically about sex work criminalization. Criminalization and policing impacts different people in a lot of different ways. We all know that. Visibility is something that is both required to engage in sex work. You have to, in a way that is not necessarily true for a lot of other forms of criminalization. You don't have to advertise the thing that criminalizes you in most scenarios, but you got to find clients if you're a sex worker. So you got to be kind of out there. Navigating respectability politics as a form of harm reduction is a really important conversation. And who gets to do that is very often determined by a level of criminalization, and reducing that harm might be trying to navigate something that doesn't feel super comfortable. Like if I am going to a hotel to meet a client, I can dress in a way that draws attention to me, but that means that I'm going to have that attention on me when I might be navigating a space where I don't want someone to look at me and call the cops. And so figuring out who has the ability to be like, no, I'm going to throw on that blazer because no one's going to notice me, versus someone who doesn't, is absolutely something that has to be navigated, because the amount of attention that you draw as a criminalized person is going to be really different. When we, so in New York, when I was organizing, we were working, we were doing the Access to Condoms campaign. And what that was about, if you were, so this is actually, how do I explain it? Possession of condoms in most places can be and is used as evidence of prostitution. There's a couple different places in the country where that is no longer true, or where they have decided to not use that, but it's very, very few, and it actually is a global practice. And so when you think about who gets profiled as a sex worker, you're not thinking about like the NYU frat guy who's walking down the street at 3 o'clock in the morning. He's probably not concerned about carrying condoms. He's probably being encouraged to carry them. If you're talking about Black trans women who are walking around the Bronx or Brooklyn, especially in certain neighborhoods, you're probably talking about people who are already getting that level of attention. And the possession of condoms was enough for people to get arrested and for people to get a charge. And so figuring out what harm reduction looks like is very often for criminalized folks about trying to navigate what feels comfortable and true to you, and also what's going to draw too much attention. And it's a really difficult conversation, and it's really hard, and it's really uncomfortable, because we should be able to go out and celebrate sex work and abortion and the ways that we live our bodies and the ways that we connect our bodies to each other. But not everyone actually has the privilege to do that. And so when we're talking about who is criminalized, we have to talk about also whose bodies are policed and what does that look like. And so I want to also echo the, Ricky was talking about know your rights information being really important. Knowing where you can call if something does happen, safety planning, because so much of getting arrested is just the terror of not knowing what's going to happen, or who might pick up your kids, or who might, feed your cat. If you get picked up on a Friday night, you're not going to be arraigned until Tuesday at 9. And so safety planning is super important, and getting with your community is really important. And the other thing is, I believe very much in community. I was a community organizer for a long time. I find safety in community, and I find harm reduction grounded in a really deep understanding and assessment of what policing in your local area looks like. And that comes from community knowledge. And that comes from talking to people and saying, what has this experience been for you, and how have you navigated it, and how can we learn from each other to keep each other safe? And that also means that your proximity to non-criminalization means that you get to take on more of the liability for other people who have a closer proximity to policing, and whose bodies and presence are going to be policed in a different way than you. And so, if you're working together out of a hotel and one of you is white or white passing and one of you is Black, if you are white, that is your credit card that goes down, because you might catch a prostitution charge, while a darker skinned person might catch a third party charge, or a promoting charge, or a manager's charge. And that's a much higher misdemeanor, and it might even be a felony. And so understanding the way that policing happens for different folks in your community, I don't want to call it a responsibility, because self-determination. But I think being in community means that understanding your liability and understanding the liability of the folks around you, and recognizing that, like, she's safe, we safe, is incredibly important to be able, because we're not just talking about the personal ability to do something, we're talking about the liberation of communities here. And we have to learn from and look out for each other, and recognize the ways that we might be able to put our skin and our bodies on the line for each other, to make sure that that community liberation is a value that we're living into. I'll pop it over to Makayla.
Yeah, so going off of what Kate said, so we know that forms of protection are so privileged based off of the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is I guess for me, what I've experienced with the hierarchy is, I've been a stripper for a really long time, but I see strippers think that they're up here and that full service sex workers are down here, because they don't think they're on the same level. Sex workers are all on the same level. Get that out of the way. We're all on the same playing field, but not when it comes to privilege. So, the protection that we get at the strip clubs is bouncers, managers, people watching us and making sure that we're okay. People who are doing different forms of sex work may not have that privilege and that protection on their side, because they are so visible, and they're like more policed than we are. So they're taking like much more of a risk. And so I feel like, you know, people who do have that privilege of protection, we have like, it is a public good for us to be sharing that information, like skill sharing and our knowledge. We need to be spreading it to people who may not have access to those things.
Thank you so much for that input. And, you know, so while we're on the topic of criminalization, we've discussed some ways that we can maybe prevent criminalization from happening in the first place. But what if someone is actively in the position of being criminalized? What are steps they can take to, you know, help protect themselves at this point, especially if they don't necessarily have the resources to get a lawyer?
This was definitely a tricky question for us, and we bounced around, and knowing your rights specific to your situation. If you're undocumented, you have different rights than other folks. Also assessing your rights against what feels safe. Some people feel really safe being confrontational with law enforcement, and some people don't, and you have to make that assessment for yourself. And that's totally cool. Whatever you decide feels safe for you and feels right for you, then that's right for you. It's just important to go in knowing what your rights are. When I have this conversation with community, it also is take the fingerprint and the phone or the face recognition off of your phone. They cannot require you to put in a password. But they can require you without a warrant to do those other two things. So take that off. And also, don't talk. Cops are not your friend. Law enforcement is not your friend. And that's including, unfortunately, if you've been victimized. You know, we see more and more where people are in this gray zone of, you're not arrested, but we're going to hold you indefinitely. And that's something that cops can do. But that means that you aren't arrested, so you don't have access to the right to an attorney. And they still might take your phone, and they still might search your phone, and they still might be waiting for, you know, your manager to call because they assume you have to have one. Or if you're a substance user, for your dealer to reach out so they can pop that person. Know that any time that especially criminalized folks and police bodies interact with the legal system, it's an adversarial experience, and protecting yourself in all spaces means going in knowing your rights, going in knowing what you're comfortable with, going in having a safety plan before crisis happens, and making sure that at every single space that you're in, you're doing what feels really right for you, because you know, not everyone has the privilege to be really aggressive or really adversarial with law enforcement. And, you know, your physical safety matters, your emotional safety matters, your psychological safety matters. All of those are really important. And only you know what is right for those circumstances and for your body.
Ricky, Makayla, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
I got nothing. Kate said it all.
Something I'll add is just that if you know that there are, and this goes back to what we were saying before, right? If you know that there are legal responders, that you know, maybe it's not necessarily a lawyer, but it's somebody like a paralegal or somebody who can advocate for you just because they know this experience a lot more, especially if you're new to the space. Know who those people are, either memorize those numbers or whatever you need to do to make sure that, you know, if you get that call, you can make that call, right? And somebody that you trust, that you've like sort of seen in practice, or, you know at least from anecdotal things from someone you trust.
So before we switch over to some of the audience questions, I would love for you all to take a moment on the panel as well as everyone else who's listening in today, to envision what a world without criminalized bodies would look like to you. And once you've had a moment to sort of think about that, I would love to hear from our panelists what that world looks like to you.
I can start. I think, and you know, it sounds like cheesy, but I think it's what it sounds like when we think about reproductive justice, right? It looks like people who are able to have children having complete bodily autonomy, and being able to make the decision to not have children or have those children, and raise their families in a safe environment of their choosing, right? That is the full definition of reproductive justice. It's not just about having access to abortion. It's about, if you don't want to have an abortion, you having the ability to have a child in a safe environment, free from violence or brutality, namely at this moment from the police, right? That's the example that I'm using. It means that sex workers will be able to do their work safely and have families at the same time. We think about these two things as if they're like two totally different worlds, right? As if sex workers do not have families, do not have spouses, do not have partners, do not have children. It's just not, they are very often part of the same exact world, right? And so those sex workers being able to have those families and have access to healthcare, to live in whatever neighborhood they want to live in, to use drugs if they choose to use drugs, and not have people call the police on them, or try to take their children that they have worked to keep safe and healthy away from them, right? To be able to have a whole family live safely and free of stigma. That's what it looks like to me. And really this idea of like, what does that look like then if the police aren't there? It looks like, and I think Kate's going to talk a lot about this, right, is community care. And this idea that there are so many things that we talk about wanting to be liberated from, but it'd be really amazing to be liberated into community care.
Beautifully put.
Yeah. And, you know, I think reproductive justice is such a beautiful framework for this, because, yeah, I think freedom in a world without criminalized bodies is liberation. And it means that, you know, when we really think about what reproductive justice means, it means, yes, birth, and it means, yes, the ability to choose that and to have that, but it means families, and it means multi-generational families. And so if we're going to free ourselves and say, you know, the family unit, however you define that, is, and however you decide to form that, is the core, and that is what we're going to protect for generations upon generations, then we have to look at the full system. We have to look at police as an actors of state violence. We have to look at prisons. We have to look at transformative justice. We have to look at anti-capitalism in the ways that that is about controlling bodies as well. Capitalism is about turning people into capital. And so when we're talking about, you know, criminalization, we're talking about social control that engineers bodies, and it engineers families, and it engineers communities to be in service to something else, and to something that we actually don't consent to. No one consents to poverty. And so, you know, when we're talking about liberation, we have to talk about liberation from so many of these different forms of collective social and state violence, and liberating ourselves from them. And yeah, I love that phrase, and I'm totally going to credit you and use it moving forward, that we want to talk about liberation into as well as liberation from. And, you know, when we dream these things, when we think about, you know, it can be so scary to remove not necessarily the police, but honestly, the idea of the police more so than anything else. We're going to envision things that are incredible and that we haven't seen before. And the the way that is going to reflect on the ways that we interact with each other, and the ways that we understand liberation, and the ways that we understand consent and control, all of that is going to be wrapped up into each other. And so, you know, I love the question of, what does liberation feel like? What does liberation mean to you? Because it's so holistic. It's almost like the concept of God. Like, it's so big and it's so transformative that we almost don't have language and words for it. And it's going to take a lot of testing, and it's going to take a lot of trials. And, you know, I encourage all of you to celebrate Miriam Kaba every single day for her incredible work on prison and policing and liberation and abolition. And as she says, right now, it's going to take 1,000 tiny experiments and trials to figure it out. But freedom from criminalized bodies is about envisioning something greater than we have ever envisioned before, and living into values of freedom and self-determination and family and love and joy in a way that we cannot even begin to conceptualize, but it is the most exciting, imaginative work that we could ever be doing right now.
Y'all are on fire today. Makayla, what does that world look like for you?
So, to be cheesy, like Ricky. So for me, I mean, reproductive justice, we all three of us were saying that, like, our ideal world looks like what reproductive justice says it looks like. You know, it names capitalism as one of our oppressors, and we abolish that, move past it. We are all abolitionists in my eyes. That's what I want to see. I want to see people get free healthcare for whatever they want and whatever they need. And you know, for me, I don't think that there can be liberation without recognizing the humanity and the bodies that have been criminalized, and that we really need to, you know, throw away what we think what respectability looks like and move past it. Otherwise, we're not going to get very far, you know. So that just means, like, for right now, us supporting each other, really building on community. That's what it looks like for me, and I think that's what it'll look like for a pretty good while. But, you know, Kate's right, it's going to take 1,000 little tiny experiments before we really get there. But, you know, I'm really excited that we're all working to get there. We're all doing these experiments, whether it be here together, like nationally, or in our communities. So that's nice to see.
Indeed it is. So we have a few audience questions that came in. I'm going to, whoever feels like picking these up, or if all of you have something to say, please feel free to chime in. The first one that came in was, how has the reproductive health, rights, and justice movement shown up around decriminalization of sex work, and how would you want the movement to show up?
I'll take this one because I think about this a lot. Well, okay, so a couple things that I don't know. I'm not as familiar with the wider sort of like reproductive health space. I am more familiar with the very specific space of reproductive justice, which is to say that I am most practiced in a space that is led by Black women who, for those of you who actually didn't know, the term reproductive justice was founded by 12 Black women who felt the need to merge reproductive rights and racial justice, right? To make reproductive justice, because they were not being heard or listened to or prioritized. Their bodies were not being prioritized by the reproductive rights movement. That being said, sorry, I just got distracted by the little chat. The reproductive justice space is not always super inclusive of sex work. I was at a reproductive justice conference last year with women from across the country who are doing this work, and me saying the words sex work is reproductive justice was a little bit confounding, and maybe even threatening to some people, right? So what I would say is that in general, that space is probably a lot more open than than a lot of other reproductive health spaces. And it's still definitely something that you have to kind of convince somebody that sex work is part of reproductive justice. And that's going to take some time to undo. And I think that that has to do with stigma and respectability politics in a lot of ways. So at least from what I've experienced, it's definitely still a marginalized part of reproductive justice.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's a growing edge. And I think that there's a want and a desire, specifically really in repro justice spaces, to figure out where sex work fits in, and figure out kind of what it means and where the connections are. And I think it's a really important part of it. And I also think, you know, it's even more, there's even more of a gap between reproductive rights and sex work. If you look at the history of how more traditional feminism has treated sex work, it's been some of the spaces that are actually most damaging and most pro-criminalization is more traditional feminist spaces. And so, you know, there was a lot of groups that were pushed out of those spaces, including, you know, queer folks, including folks of color, including criminalized folks and migrant folks who didn't find a home in traditional feminism, and sex workers were one of those. And so I think that reproductive justice spaces have come to realize the connection between sex workers and reproductive justice. I can't remember who said it, but the idea that sex workers are actually caregivers. There was one recent piece of research that we did, and 40% of the sex workers who responded were supporting other family members, especially kids, and that's not surprising. You know, there's no audience, even the most traditional feminist audiences who are very anti-sex work. The moment I say, tell me what you would not do for your child to keep that kid housed and fed, and everyone gets it. And so, you know, there's a lot of growth that needs to happen. There's a lot of, especially in more traditional spaces, amends and repair and humility that needs to happen around the violence that was caused, that is still being caused to sex workers under the name of feminism. But I see reproductive justice spaces as some of the most welcoming and thoughtful, and excited to recognize that our collective solidarity is really about what it means for people who are pushed out to find economic security in the way that works for them.
Makayla, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I just wanted to like say, like, they're 100% right on what they're saying, Ricky and Kate. And yeah, I just feel that it's true, like reproductive justice has been a home for me as a sex worker. That's like where I have found, you know, a community, but not, you know, the same way with like reproductive health organizations, reproductive rights organizations. You know, there's still so much stigma against sex workers in the reproductive healthcare system. You know, I still have issues finding healthcare providers who are cool with treating a sex worker because they have so much stigma attached to them, and like a whorephobia. Y'all know whorephobia is just like the, you know, disgust of sex workers, whether it be like in big ways or small ways. You know, they're still treating us unfair. But I feel like, you know, reproductive justice, because it comes from, you know, Black women and, you know, Black trans women, Black sex working women, it's been such a home for that reason, you know, because they've built it up to be that. And so, yeah, that's what I think.
Great. So what are some concrete ways that we can push back against the stigmatization of sex work?
There was also a question that just came in around carceral feminism, and because that's been mentioned, I just want to, I feel like everyone can toss in some great definitions. It was a term invented by Elizabeth Bernstein that talks about the relationship between traditional feminism and the relationship to the state, and proximity to the state and reinforcement of state control and state power, namely through criminalization, as an element of feminism and as an element of showing of being a woman was about participating and often being a catalyst for criminalization. So I would want to pause if anyone else wants to throw in there, but it felt like that might be an easy.
Can we repeat the question? And because then I'm gonna also say that, well, okay, let me just say this first, I guess. There's, if you're the type of person that really appreciates like just reading a book and trying to understand more, Unapologetic by Charlene Carruthers does get into carceral feminism, and it is written from a Black queer feminist perspective. Radical perspective, so it's definitely sort of one of those. I think it's rare that we can find sort of a book that is from exactly the point of view that we're trying to push right now, and this is one of them. And so if you have a chance to read, it's called Unapologetic by Charlene Carruthers, who is also just an amazing activist. Do that.
And I apologize for that kind of shift. I know we use that term, and so I wanted to make sure. But yeah, I think the question about destigmatizing folks that trade sex is really important, especially because like everyone can do it. You don't have to dedicate your life to sex worker rights to promote destigmatization. I think first and foremost, just saying the word, asking the spaces that you're in, what is your stance on sex work? How do you make this space accessible and safe for people who are trading sex, whether or not they want to disclose? And then media narratives, you know, I remember, and like, I'm old, I'm not that old, but I remember there was a time when I was young and trying to figure out what this experience meant and who to look to and how to understand what this was. And you turn on the television and there are two representations of sex workers. You are either committing a crime and you are probably a sociopath and you're probably robbing people a lot, or you showed up in a body bag. And those were really the two ways that we understood sex work for a very long time. And so there's so many different stories about sex work. There's so many ways that we can think about it. There's so many ways that it can be portrayed. And sex workers, like, it's the same thing as if you are giving someone a voice or using your voice to someone else, you're probably actually silencing. And there's a lot of people who trade sex who are talking about their experience more, who are sharing those narratives and who are controlling their own media. And so, you know, we can talk about like what it means to be a trans sex worker, or we could actually just go read it and uplift some of those stories, and we can, you know, collectively sit down and watch Tangerine together. It's a great movie. You know, we can actually uplift some of those spaces where sex workers, you know, that was not by a sex worker, but it centers a pretty honest narrative. And we can actually bring those voices forward, and we can uplift those voices as able to speak for themselves, because not only is it enriching, and sex workers have amazing, incredible stories, and it's super, super fun. Like, sex work community is awesome. And lifting up people as the experts on their own experience doesn't just enrich the audience. It actually says, when it comes to policy, when it comes to decision making, when it comes to who should come in and train your harm reduction organization, it actually informs all of that too. It's an iterative process that says that we value these voices and we honor these voices, and we are able to sit and listen to this expertise, and we are better for it. And so I think that, you know, stigma is, yes, about telling more of those stories and using it more. And when someone makes a shitty joke, pushing back and being like, that's actually not that funny, because making like dead sex worker jokes is low hanging fruit, especially if you want to tell Tina Fey that again and again and again. And it also says that these are voices that we can just listen to instead of making decisions about what's right for someone else's life.
Great. Makayla, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I think also because I'm young, I'm 20, so I'm around a lot of like very young people and a young crowd, and they're thinking these jokes about dead sex workers are funny, things like that, or thinking that because you have a higher number of people that you slept with, you're unclean, and like that's not okay. And like we need to destigmatize like STIs and like, you know, all those things. And it's so like painful for me to see, because I've experienced a lot of like whorephobia in leftist organizing spaces, because people think that because your politics are pretty like okay, that you're above it. And it's not, because there's so many little like micro ways that it's still coming out and that we're still seeing it. And if you're shutting it down, you're like, that could never be me, I've never been there. It's a lie, because we've all been guilty of it at some point, because it's taught to us. We're consuming it from the time we're children, and people around us are making jokes about how strippers are gross. And so I think it's just more about us, like being willing to unlearn those things and being accepting and like taking ownership of the things that we've done in order to move past it.
Amen, Makayla. I'm right with you there too. I'm all for destigmatizing STIs. Yay, HPV in the house once before. So I'm very open about that, and I love seeing that stigma start to fall away more and more, especially considering the vast majority of us will have some sort of STI in our life, and that has nothing to do with how clean or not clean we are. So moving on to the next question. What extent does the patriarchal medical system play into these criminalizations, and what can we do as non-healthcare workers to change the medical narrative away from what only works for cis white men?
Not to come back to like midwives and doulas, but to come back to midwives and doulas. Midwives and doulas, okay, let's go further back actually. Before there were specific people that delivered the baby during a birth, it was always women. Now that part of that is part of the patriarchy, right? That like the man couldn't be there, that wasn't his business, and you know, he didn't need trauma or something. I don't know. But also in that process of thousands of years of women delivering babies, women learned things. Women became experts in delivering those babies. And at some point we decided that no, this male-dominated profession, doctors were actually the people who needed to be delivering the babies. Now, are there lots of women OBGYNs? Yes. But the medical system is also a patriarchal system. And so when you are learning through patriarchy, I don't know if y'all have come up on social media or really anywhere, the like sort of shots of medical like textbooks that you would think were maybe from like a couple decades ago at least, but it turns out they're from like 2 years ago, right? Doctors are coming up through these super patriarchal, really problematic learning systems, which are also, you know, universities. And that makes it so that midwives and doulas who are still centering around the person who was giving birth, and the experiences of the many people that they have helped give birth or not give birth, because I think that there's a lot of space, there's a lot of attention put on doulas and midwives of people as people who only deliver babies, and I think it's important to remember that doulas do more than that, and so do midwives. That we moved away from those experts being the ones who delivered the babies, the ones who were experts because they were experienced in working with people, and not because they were experienced in staring at books. I'm not anti-doctor. My partner is going to med school. Like that's not where I'm operating from, but it's important, right, to understand that there is an expertise that people have that we just widely ignore.
Kate, was there anything that you wanted to add to this?
No, I mean, I think, Ricky touched on something really important, which is like the medical system is a medical system. It is not about health. It is not about healing. It is grounded on hierarchies, and at the same time, like, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. And so I think that we need to really think about, our relationship not to the medical system. Like, I want medical, I want health coverage for all. I also want us to have a very different view and understanding of health and healing. And so I was just reading something about how, touching on how so many of these things are built on these really awful understandings of bodies and different bodies, and especially, non-white cis male bodies. Not having pain during childbirth or having more painless childbirth was a sign of witchcraft for a while, and like could get you arrested and could get you injured. I think understanding the way that the way that system and what is generated from that system is in service to a state, and in service to a state who does want to enact control over your children, especially in the United States with its history of chattel slavery, where, reproductive labor was a form of labor, like a form of work. And that was part of the work that you were doing under chattel slavery. All of those things are incredibly important. And so, I think that much like liberation, we need to, Shira Hassan has this beautiful phrase where she said, we need to reclaim our imagination. And I think about that all the time, where I think, getting away from these systems means reclaiming the imagination that we have to dream bigger than just not this horrible thing.
Wonderful. So moving on to the next question, I'm going to combine these two, especially since, the carceral system is so deeply entwined with criminalizing Black women, Black trans women, sex workers, and Black bodies. Someone raised the point that during this moment of nationwide protest and reckoning on racial justice, we're still not seeing enough of a conversation or a push for justice for Black trans women and sex workers. So this is a bit of a two-parter, and they're somewhat tangentially related, I think, is, how can we uplift their voices and experiences in the movement, and also raise awareness around the carceral feminism that we were speaking to earlier, and how that's not the way forward for anyone, especially for Black trans women who are the most impacted by these systems.
I will give a start. Oh yeah, Caliban and the Witch is fantastic. Sylvia Federici. If you haven't read her, she's got a series of books, and they're really great about capitalism through a gender lens. Yeah, these are definitely intertwined questions and two different questions. And I think raising the voices of Black trans women, yeah, it's important. Also, resourcing Black trans women is possibly more important. You know, we talk a lot about like, have a Black trans woman come and speak, and pay her is the part that very often gets forgotten. Give your money to Black trans women, give your money to places that really center the leadership and leadership development of Black trans women. Black trans women are more than just their stories of violence. And turning that into the narrative of what it means to be a Black trans woman is really harmful. The number of like trans and gender nonconforming kids of color that see someone in their 30s and consider that person an elder and don't think that they're going to live beyond that, because the only stories that we trot out are not stories of like what it means to survive, but stories about pain. We actually just have to celebrate and resource and deeply resource communities that center those voices. And so I think it is yes, about like uplifting in a safe way, because also recognizing that like going out and doing this publicly and sharing your story means you're going to get doxxed, and means that you're going to get harassed, and means that you're going to take on a level of vulnerability that a lot of other people who are like, I'm making space for you, are you making safe space for me, is often a different question. And we can also just give our money to Black trans women very easily without putting people in jeopardy. And so I think that that is definitely part of it. And I think talking about, you know, sex workers and centering, you know, I come from a background of sex worker organizing, and I come from community, and I come from community spaces. But honestly, doing like a lot of work, the second you take some of these issues that are very complex and you center a narrative of a sex worker, you're gonna hit a lot of different forms of marginalization. So, you know, one of the histories of, I work in harm reduction spaces a lot. And a lot of times you'll go to a harm reduction space and it's really about harm reduction around substance use, predominantly injection substance users. And really they've centered the narratives of men who are substance users, and often who are white substance users. And so, okay, we've taken this framework, because that's what harm reduction is. It's about understanding harm and about doing things to mitigate some of the vulnerability. And the second you're like, what if I took this framework and I centered sex workers, then all of a sudden you're talking about interpersonal violence, you're talking about state violence, you're talking about health, you're talking about all these different forms of things. And so, you know, if we think about accessibility, if we think about multidimensional issues, if we think about issues outside of kind of these tiny silos and that are much more informed by institutional fixes than by looking at people holistically in the many ways that they find strength and community and self-determination, centering sex workers, you kind of hit a lot of the things that you don't have to come back for later. And so I think, you know, it is, I honestly like, yes, sex work is a space that is very near and dear to me. And it's really practical to just start by centering sex workers, and especially looking at the community really and all the different facets of who is part of that community and who is having that experience.
I love how you highlight the practicality of centering sex workers, because that is at the intersection of so many different issues. I think that's a great way to think about it. Ricky, Makayla, I'm going to hand it over to y'all.
Yeah, I just want to quickly lift up sort of, first of all, yeah, Kate said something really important about when you're lifting people up. Part of it is that, like, yes, people need to be lifted up, but most of the time they need to be trusted to tell you like what they need. So I am going to tell y'all really quickly about a group of trans and gender nonconforming people in New Orleans that are actually investing in like a community land trust, because space, we've talked a lot about space. We've talked a lot about the things that people need, and the fact that like the people experiencing that marginalization know best what they need, and what they know they need is space, right? So House of Tulip in New Orleans is run by trans and gender nonconforming people in Louisiana, and basically they're raising a bunch of money to buy themselves a house so that they can have a safe space, a la Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera in the early days of the queer liberation movement. I dropped their link in the chat. So go there, learn about them. If you have the means, lift them up with resources, also known as money. And yeah, I think that was all I wanted to say on that.
Yeah, I just want to say like the best way to like center these voices is to, you know, include them, pay them for their time and their experiences, you know, celebrate them while they're alive, because we forget to do that a lot of the time. We just, you know, go straight to the mourning and grieving phase because that's when we, you know, mostly see their existence. So I just think we need to change a lot of the ways that we like, you know, empathize and interact with those people, you know.
So we have reached the end of our time period for the questions now, and we've gotten to the questions the audience sent in. So I would love to take a moment to express my appreciation for all of you today, Ricky, Kate, Makayla. This was especially moving to me personally. I'm a 37-year-old woman living in New York, and I never thought I would live to see the day where I could openly say, I'm a former sex worker. I'm also a director of communications. I always thought that I would have to spend the rest of my life closeted about who I was and where I've been in my life. And hearing conversations like this, I can't describe how it makes me feel. It's really beautiful, and it's the world that I've always wanted to live in, and seeing it come into being and knowing that people like you and everyone really on this call who's learning more, doing this work to destigmatize is everything. And also that goes for decriminalizing what choices we make with our bodies, our pregnancies, and how we choose to live our lives. So thank you all so much today for coming and for sharing this wealth of knowledge that you have. I'm so proud just to sit and moderate a panel with all of y'all. And I see the praise is just coming in on the comments, so I hope you guys can soak that up. So I'm going to hand this off to Dan to close us out, but thank you so much for today.
Yes, thank you so much, all of y'all who sat on the panel. Of course, as always, all of the URGE staff who made sure that things ran smoothly. It feels relevant to say, so I will remind folks that tomorrow after our last panel, I believe from 8 Eastern to 10 Eastern, we're gonna have folks from Chocolate City Burlesque perform, and then also a DJ set. And we will have their Venmos and Cash Apps and all of those things, so we can definitely do work to be putting our money where our mouth is and supporting folks, supporting sex workers. Again, as always, for the third time, thank you so much to the RGV Language Justice Collective for holding us down for interpretation. We appreciate y'all so much. Yeah, so tomorrow's session, same bat time, same bat channel. That's not true. There's a link. Click the correct link. But we'll be talking about repro healthcare for trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. I hope to see y'all again tomorrow for the last session. Everybody have a good night, and I'll see y'all later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.